Wait, no. How's that?
I just hit record, by the way. Go ahead, talk again.
Is that better? Is it still too loud? I cut it like 20%.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay.
Looks good on the meters, I think. What's going on?
Not too much. Gotta find my show notes. Ah, there we go. Oh, you got Animal Crossing?
I did. How'd you know that?
It's in the show notes.
Oh, did I put it in the show notes? I did. I got it a week ago. So many people talk
If you send me your friend ID, we can actually visit each other's islands, I think.
Yeah, I've never done it, so I just had to switch. I didn't know how that worked. How do I get a friend ID? Set up somewhere?
Yeah, it's in your
profile.
profile.
I've got stuff piled up everywhere because I have no way to put anything. I don't have a house.
You can put it in your house. Do you have your house yet?
No, it's supposed to come tomorrow. I just paid for it today.
Okay. Yeah, you can put stuff in your house once it comes. But
I got stuff piled everywhere. It's like unbelievable. look here. Look at my. I think stuff piled everywhere. I guess you were like that too at some point.
No.
I've been harvesting like crazy. Every day I get all my wood. I pick all the apples, and it's just been piling the crap up because I don't.
So I basically got. So I only played for a couple hours, maybe an hour and a half each day. But I got enough stuff the first day. I got enough stuff the first day to get my house.
I had no idea. I didn't even know a house was a thing. Like I haven't. Like I'm just kind of going along, and then I'm finding stuff.
I didn't either, but I think it's more that. I play games a lot more, so I know what cues to look for progression.
Okay, yeah.
So it's not like I had no idea there was a house either, but like I know who to talk to, and when they like say something a certain way, it's like, oh, that's something I should investigate further.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to understand that now. Yeah.
Oh, I had something good for stories, although we now have 3 really good stories, so I think we can hold it off.
It's fun. But I mean, I pick it up. I think maybe one day I didn't pick it up, but I just pick it up like in the morning and then again at night for a little while. I mean,
that's one thing I don't. The thing I don't like about it is the time thing, because like I only pick it up at night, usually after Jonah falls asleep, and so like it's always like 10:30. Yeah, like although yesterday there were shooting stars, so apparently today there's going to be a bunch of stars on the shore. So I might grab it during lunch.
It's fascinating.
But yeah, it's fun. So what did I do this week? We
hit record on the audio too. We do a couple of claps. All right. So John, waiting for John's Mac to reboot, I guess.
Yeah, I always just tell it to ask me tomorrow.
Huh?
I always tell my Mac just to ask me tomorrow. So it hasn't updated.
I don't even have one in here. Don't have one at all.
I only keep it because I have it. And it feels like it's too old to sell.
You have it?
Yeah. And I use it. I don't want to purchase a new laptop, even though I know I can get a pretty cheap one.
Yeah.
And I use it if I'm doing something around the house that's not at my desk.
You have it. I just don't have one, and I sold the last one I had. I got a couple of old ones here that my kids had when they were younger. But, I mean, they won't even run the latest software or anything. So, that pie hole thing yesterday was driving me crazy.
I wish I had told you about that, because I figured that out about a week ago. I was like, I just started getting ads. I was like, oh crap, my pie hole broke. And so I started looking around, looking. And I'm like,
I log into the pie hole, it looks like it's working.
Yeah, I was so angry. And then I'm like, wait a minute. I remember seeing a notification from Firefox saying that they turned on HTTPS DNS. I bet you they're using their own DNS server.
But you know what's pretty bad about? I guess we'll save this for the show. But it's pretty
Yeah.
bad that your browser is now picking a different DNS server and you don't know it. That's kind of bad. I guess for the average user, that kind of makes sense, I guess.
Yeah, the thing is that it does harm for somebody like us, but it's actually better for the general populace because now they're going over HTTPS. And it's prompt. I haven't set it up yet, but I'm planning on setting up DNS over HTTPS myself for my Pi hole. But I just haven't configured it yet.
Why would you need to do that?
Because DNS requests.
Why do you need?
No. So the DNS requests go. Yep.
Going out over HTTPS. All right. Yeah.
Yep.
That makes sense. So
and there's a Cloudflare plugin that you have to install, I guess, and I use Cloudflare anyway for my endpoints. I don't care.
Do you use Cloudflare already?
Cloudflare's endpoint, yeah.
That's what the default is on Firefox. When it's turned on, it's pointing to Cloudflare.
Yep. So I'm planning on.
I think Google's.
I trust Google less and less the more.
Yeah, I do too. I don't trust them at all, but
I go along. So I don't. Google's not even one of the options. I use Cloudflare, and then I use, I think, OpenDNS.
Oh, you're using? Oh, I'm using OpenDNS. That's what I'm using.
But I don't think OpenDNS supports DNS over HTTPS. I'm not sure though.
Yeah, that's what I'm using. I'm using OpenDNS on my Pi.
Yeah, I'm using Cloudflare first. And then
I need to go back and revisit those settings at some point.
Yeah, I need to go through this. I mean, I updated my list. I was like, why am I getting YouTube ads?
Exact thing. I was like, and then I'm sitting and I'm doing research and I'm saying HTTPS, and then I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute, let me just check another browser when I read that. So I opened up Chrome, which I'd never use, and there were no ads there. I was like, oh, it's browser-based problem. Then I realized what was going on.
That's what I realized too, because I was getting ads. There's a World Meter, which is one of the best trackers I've found for coronavirus. And I started getting ads there. That's where I first noticed it. Right. And then I noticed my phone wasn't getting them. And so I was like, you know what? Maybe it's browser specific. And I was like, oh God. Oh no. At first I thought it was my computer started using a different DNS server for some reason. And so I'm like, so I started looking at how to check which DNS endpoint because it's supposed to use my router. Yeah. And then I remembered
first thought was, oh, wait a second. This laptop is on wireless and my desktop is on hardwire. Maybe there's a different DNS setting. And I was like, oh, so I spent a good hour mucking around with that.
Yeah, it took me, I spent maybe 20 minutes looking at the actual Pi hole, and then I gave up for like a night. And then the next morning, as I was thinking about it, I was like, oh yeah. And then it took me 5 minutes to figure out what the setting was.
But it's pretty amazing though that the Pi hole, man, I just set it up and it's been running for 6 months and I've done nothing to it and it just works. You know, you just almost forget about it. And it wasn't until I started to see ads again. I'm like, wait a second. Something's up.
Yeah, it was weird. So John's reboot.
See, I don't have any new messages from him. Do you?
No, he said 9 minutes, but that was 18 minutes ago.
I'm not going to be able to go.
One of my clients 3D printed me.
30. What?
One of my clients 3D printed John and I face masks.
Oh, that was nice.
So that we can provide, and you can use like HEPA filters or like furnace HEPA filters to replace the filter medium or media. No, they're shipping it today, and the filters are showing up. So they supposedly N95 quality.
Really?
So it's much better than the cloth mask that Joanna and I were able to make on short notice.
Yeah, we're all kind of using whatever we can get.
Yeah, it makes me wish I had invested in a 3D printer. I've been thinking about it for a couple of years, but knowing myself, I knew it would be a novelty that I would barely ever use. So I
Exactly.
couldn't quite justify the price tag at the time.
Right.
And, but I'm contemplating. We lost John. I don't know if he had a chance to go over the notes. Did you add the? Oh, he added the tree stuff. Yeah,
I added a few things. We didn't have any sections in here on suggestions, naming conventions. Not sure if there's a lot of stuff in here.
Yeah, I didn't want to add.
Hello? Nope. Hold on. That one should be better. Hello?
Yep. Oh. How long is Oomph sponsoring for the month of April?
Can you guys tell that somebody short was using my using?
I was just gonna say I need to raise mine up so you see the top of my head and you see the bottom of John's.
Look at that.
Oh, would you look at that? We haven't recorded since I shaved.
I don't think so.
No, probably not. Because the last one.
Week.
Yeah, I shaved last weekend.
Right. All right.
All right.
Late here, and I've got to move on with my day. So, are we ready to roll?
Yeah, I gotta find some show notes, but other than that, I'll catch up.
I'll give you a second to do that.
Twig, is that what we're talking about?
Yep.
The twig is up. Oh, that's hilarious.
I spent a small amount of time trying to figure that one out.
Like the creative titles, we don't do them very often. Twig is up.
That's hilarious.
There were, I don't remember them all, but there were some that were better, but they made no sense.
The twig is up.
Plans. Oh yeah, that's a good one. DNS over HTTPS. Interesting. What the hell is that beeping noise? Oh. All right, let's go. Go.
What's that?
Yeah, I'm good.
Do that again. Let me adjust the video so we're all on one line. It's a little nicer at the end. For editing. Okay. This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 244. The twig is up. Hey, welcome to Talking Drupal. Our thoughts and prayers are with the Drupal community as the world continues to fight COVID-19. And on today's show, we're going to be talking about all things related to Twig. Hi, guys.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hope everyone is well. John, what's new with you?
That's a great question. Just doing the working at home thing and getting on, getting family members set up with Zoom, and it's kind of interesting. I give I think every week since we started kind of this pandemic, I have been talking about like the homeschooling situation and the using of Zoom and stuff like that. But it's really interesting to me. Like over the last couple of weeks, I've had calls with friends, all using Zoom, and like prior to that, it was very much like I don't know, like we're in a box, and I'm like, oh well, I gotta find time to like physically meet with you in order to like have a conversation and in order to like to catch up. But I think this environment that we're in has kind of changed that and opened my mind a little bit to being able to have Zoom calls with my friends that I don't see all the time. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yes. Some levels, I feel like I'm keeping in touch better than I did before. Weird, right?
Yeah. It's all the time that we have on our hands now.
I guess.
I think it's some of it. And then
I feel like I have all that much time, more time.
I don't know. I feel like, it's weird because I definitely feel like I have more time, but I feel like it's filled with other things like things I didn't have to worry about before, like entertaining kids. And, I am also doing a lot more cooking. So like cooking dinner, which is actually for me a lot of fun. I always enjoy cooking. So, there are some people that I've been talking to that are like, I've ordered like for takeout every day since this thing started. And I'm just kind of like, wow, I don't know.
It kind of defeats the purpose of isolating.
Yeah. I got takeout once, I think. Just once in this 5 weeks. What's it been? 5 weeks, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
4 or 5 weeks.
Which is funny because we have this meme going at Oomph that every day is Wednesday. Because like everybody's like, oh, like you literally have to put so much thought into like, what day is it today?
Exactly. Nick, what's new with you?
Yeah, that's funny. So for us, is just a couple of things this week where we've been actually working on painting our shed, which is normally a pretty boring topic, but has been the highlight of our week, having something to do outside. And in slightly sadder news, but not quite serious, my dog scratched his paw early this week, and he was getting fairly obsessed with licking it, so we had to get him a cone. This is the first time I've had a dog in the house with a cone. I feel so bad for him, but
you're moving all your breakables up to higher shelves.
You probably adjust to it quicker than you do, though, right?
It's been a couple of days. He hasn't quite adjusted yet. It's fairly comical watching him try to navigate. Even just walking through the kitchen. I mean, the other day, he was out in the kitchen. We turned the light off because normally he would just go into the office and lay down where the light is on, or go into the mudroom and lay down. And I went out there like 10 minutes after we shut the light, and he was just standing in the middle of the dark room with his tail between his legs and like looking at me like, what am I supposed to do? I can't move.
Yeah.
But
like
yeah. So, I mean, I'm giving him some time with it off. Like he can certainly eat with it on, and he can drink water with it on, but he hasn't quite figured that out. So, I'm giving him periods without it where he's in the office with me, and I can make sure he's not fussing with it. But it seems to be getting better. He was limping pretty bad yesterday, and today he's mostly back to normal. So hopefully he heals quickly. But it's been a source of entertainment over the last couple of days, watching him try to walk down the hallway with the cone on.
You should start a YouTube channel. That's what people do now.
Yeah, we'll see about that. How about you, Stephen? What's new with you this week?
Really? Yeah, nothing. Like John said, every day's Wednesday, kind of. One interesting thing is like when we're chatting with some of my colleagues in the federal government, people talking about all the shows they're watching and stuff, and I've watched way less television now. Bizarre, right?
It's super interesting that
almost no television.
It's super interesting that you say that because we have YouTube TV, so we have like a DVR. We record shows, but we're getting into that season now where like the shows are doing kind of their season finale and like going to the summer months where they're not releasing new shows, and we're actually finding that we're watching more shows on Amazon and Netflix that we may not have necessarily watched. Like, I know people are going to send me messages about like, dude, you live under a rock, but like we're catching up on like the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel on Amazon, and seriously considering Tiger King on Netflix, even though, I hear it's about just a group of very deplorable people, but Yeah, so I don't know. I think it's going to be a summer of catching up on all of those things that typically I wouldn't watch.
I also broke down and got Animal Crossing last week after the show when Nick was chatting about it. So I've been spending my last week harvesting.
So that's also interesting to me because that's changed my frame of mind on social media quite a bit. Because I honestly thought up until last week's show, people were just really like very much into like Animal Crossings on like highways and train tracks and stuff. And I'm just like, why is this all of a sudden such like a huge deal? And now I'm like, oh, people are talking about a game. Got it. Okay.
Right, yeah. So let's move on to our stories of the week. John, you have the first one in here.
I do. So I'm going to unmute myself and talk about it. As everybody knows, last week's show was focused on the Drupal Association and how we can, they're in need of our help. Well, over the last week or so, Dries and his wife have committed up to $100,000 in matching for the Drupal Association. So if you donate to the Drupal Cares initiative, if you donate $10, Dries is going to match your $10, so it's actually $20. So, again, that's awesome of him to do that. And if you haven't donated yet, I would advise you to go out and do so. Because even $10 can now be $20, which can be very helpful to the DA. So it's a bit of good news.
Yeah, it's great. As we're recording this right now, it's up to they've met it's at the $50,000 mark for that 100,000.
Oh, that's awesome.
And we do have a brief message from him now. Insert here. Let me just get my arms. Okay. So let's jump to the next story.
That's me.
Next story. Go ahead, Nick.
So the next thing to come out of this week is GitHub is now free for teams. So I got an email earlier this week. They basically bumped a bunch of things down. So if you are on GitHub and you have teams, you can now have unlimited public and private repositories, unlimited collaborators. And I think the biggest limit is 2,000 action minutes per month, which I don't actually know what they are. So I imagine that probably doesn't affect most people. They also reduce the cost if you still require a paid team. So it's instead of $9 per person, it's now $4 per person. And I think the main change there that will bump people from free to team is that you can require reviewers for pull requests. So I imagine a lot of companies will still need to have that, but it's going to cut their costs by more than 50%, which is nice, especially in times such as now. So looking forward to seeing. I mean, I like a lot of people were somewhat skeptical when Microsoft purchased GitHub. It's always concerning when things are consolidated like that, but it seems that at least so far, Microsoft has been a good steward of the project.
Yeah, it's super.
I think another change with this, and I can't remember if this just happened this week or was sooner, is if you are a paying customer, you had a limit depending on how much you paid on private repositories. I think it's gone. It's unlimited now for everybody.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that was the big thing for me. Obviously, we're GitHub users at Oomph, but personally, I'm also a GitHub user, and I wanted to create a Git repository for my personal website, but I didn't necessarily want it to be a public repository because, for no other reason than, it's kind of messy and not really great for anybody else to use except me. But I couldn't because of the previous policies. So super excited now to be able to get a couple private repositories up there and be able to use, version control and in some of my personal projects.
The last story we have today, not really a story, more of a public awareness announcement. I have a pie hole that I use we've talked about it in the past, that I use to filter out ads in my house and spam and stuff. And I noticed this past week that all of a sudden the ads started showing up again in my browser. So I did some investigating and learned that Firefox, in the recent release of Firefox, they have turned on by default their DNS over HTTPS setting. And what that does is it basically, when you're sitting in Firefox, it ignores whatever DNS setting, if you have this on, it ignores whatever DNS setting you have on your computer or network and goes to, I think it's Cloudflare by default, but you could pick another HTTPS provider. And that feature just went on. So I'm a Firefox user, and all of a sudden my ads were showing up. It's because my DNS was going someplace else. So if you're interested in more details, we have a link in the show notes. But if you use Firefox, raise your hand. Anyone use Firefox, you need to be aware of that setting because your DNS may be ignored right now.
And I just want to mention, too, that for the vast majority of users of Firefox, this is a huge win for privacy. It's just people like Steven and I who override DNS and have like a hosted server locally that this caused problems for. I think it was a good move that Firefox put in place. It gives a lot more people control over their own data, and it's definitely in line with kind of the Mozilla Foundation kind of ethos. So it's not something that I'm concerned that they implemented. It just happened to cause problems for Steven and I.
And for me, it didn't cause any problems because I was already using Cloudflare's DNS, and I have ad blocking at my router level. So I was just blissfully unaware and cruising the internet.
All right, let's move on to our primary topic. Today we're talking about Twig. We did talk about Twig back on episode 58. Was it that long ago?
It's been a very long time.
Oh, so we haven't talked about Twig in that long. So today we're going to talk about Twig and just give some tips and tricks and some things you ought to know about if you haven't done anything with Twig yet. If you are using Twig, maybe we can provide some tips that you weren't aware of. So first, what is Twig?
So Twig is a PHP templating engine that the Drupal community introduced with Drupal 8. It was created by Fabien Potencier, who also created the Symfony framework that we use. So I think it made perfect sense to start using it. Twig was a fairly large departure from the previous templating engine that we used, which I think was PHP template in Drupal 7 and previous. Previously you were putting PHP everywhere in the templates. Twig kind of removes a lot of that stuff. It makes the templates a lot cleaner. You can still do some logic, so you can, for example, test for the existence of something before putting classes in place. But it basically forces you to move almost all the logic to either a preprocess hook or make sure that the module is providing a custom module is providing whatever information is needed. So it's removing a lot of the kind of high level logic that used to happen in the templates, and making sure that it's more consistent. So one thing that I've found is in Drupal 7 you used to sometimes get surprised by the way something reacted, and it turns out that some random block template would have 800 lines of PHP code in it, and that's the way a particular feature worked. And I find that with Drupal 8 that happens a lot less. If something weird's happening and it's not in a custom module, then and it has to do with the theming layer, then it's going to be in the .theme file. It's much easier to find, if you're looking at a project that somebody else built, it's much easier to find. Or even if you're looking at something that you built, if you've been working on a project for 3 years, it's very easy to forget that you did something. I just find it's much easier to kind of pick up where you left off and kind of unravel.
It's interesting because
Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say it's interesting because I was doing a review of a Drupal 7 site recently, and the person that was showing me the site was showing me a block template file, and it had 50 lines of PHP in it that were doing some data manipulation to the stuff that was in that template. And I was just like, I harkened back to Drupal 7 where I was like, oh wow, remember Drupal 7 where you can drop PHP into any template file you want, just kind of mess around with stuff. I'm like, those I don't know if I would say those were the days, but they were definitely different days. So with Twig, obviously, you can have quite a few different templates because you can template pretty much everything. And, I think one thing to talk about early here is the structure of your templates. I know at Oomph, we typically try to break our templates down into kind of different subfolders. So inside of our theme, we'll have a templates folder. Inside that templates folder, we'll have a folder for blocks, a folder for views, a folder for more layout related things, a folder for content types. And then we put our templates specific to those things within that folder system.
But not first question, right?
What's that? No, definitely not necessary. You can go completely Wild West and just throw your templates in the template folder, and Drupal will pick them up and use them because the names are what controls how those templates get loaded. But I was curious, what folder structure, if any, or template structure, if any, do you guys implement? And also, on a project, roughly how many templates do you guys think that you create?
I think that's a good question. Actually, I wrote that question, so I wonder if it's kind of conceited to say that it's a good question. But
I was actually thinking that, but I wasn't going to say anything.
Well, I was saying that because you said it, but then I realized as I was saying it that I'm the one that wrote that question. I think it depends on the project, and I think it's actually as far as how I organize them and how many I write. And I think it's changing. So on earlier Drupal 8 sites, especially when we were using paragraphs more heavily, there were a significant number of templates that I created. I tend to break them up by type. So I'll typically have a folder for, content types. So any content type level template will be there, even if it's different display types. So if I have, article teaser and article full, I'd have them both in the same place. I'll have a folder for paragraphs. I'll have a folder for fields. Although I have had a couple of situations where specific pages have really complex setups, and I'll have a folder just for each content type, and all the field level templates and the display level templates will be in one folder. I think
you're doing that, Nick, you're making the assumption that then your templates, your names are all replicating what the folder name was. So if you have content type based templates, the names of the templates are also have the content type in them.
Well, yeah, that's how Twig loads the templates. So right. So they all have the same. But I find that if they're all just in one folder, it's still very difficult to find a particular template that you're looking for.
So do you guys, when you're putting these folders together, do you ever consider the structure of the theme that you're using, what their folder structure is for the templates? You follow so
yeah, so I mean, we're typically creating our own custom themes for a lot of things. So we're kind of rolling our own in that regard. And to be quite honest, I don't I would have to go into and look at some of the other themes in their template folders and how they're organized. As I said, we're kind of rolling our own and breaking it down by kind of like the parts of Drupal as opposed to anything else. But
that's the way like stable is set up, stable and classy and.
That's where I pull my example from. I stopped paying attention to the parent theme that I'm using a long time ago, because I find that very often they vary wildly, and I'm almost never looking at the parent theme once it's been chosen. Right. So I typically follow what stable does, unless there's a specific overriding factor that makes sense to organize something slightly differently. So how about what's the number one tip that you guys have for using Twig? Because I remember when I was first learning Twig, it was a huge shift, and there was a fair amount of time spent just trying to figure out how to determine the structure, for example, of a particular variable, or what template to write to override something. What's kind of the first tip you give to new Twig users?
So this is actually kind of goes with the previous topic of folder structure, and you just made me think of it. But I think the first tip that I would throw out there, and I don't know that it's on this list, but I would say make sure you look at your modules and Drupal core for suggestions on templates that you need to overwrite, because a lot of times modules will have templates built into them that you can take into your own theme and use an overwrite. Same thing with core. Core has a bunch of modules, or a bunch of themes rather, template files. I'll get it right eventually. Template files that you can use as a jumping off point for the stuff that you need to customize. So I think the first tip is to look at what already exists before you kind of go rogue and start doing your own thing. Also help you in that file naming convention.
How about you, Stephen? What's the number one tip you give to people when they're starting out with Twig?
I think there's some basics. Is like debugging is like critical. So getting into debug mode. So like do a Google search, learn how to turn debugging on for Twig. I always also use the Twig Xdebug module because I do a lot of Xdebug stuff anyway. So I would always say install that in your dev environment to help you Xdebug in a Twig template. I'm not sure. I mean, you can use some other ways to do it, but Xdebug seems to be the fastest. Instead of using kint and dump and stuff, those seem archaic to me. Methods for trying to debug a Twig template, and it just seems to me, and maybe it's because of the amount of time Drupal eats out, or maybe it's been changes over time. But it seems to me it was way harder to figure out how to use things in a template 3 years ago than it is today. And maybe it's just my knowledge. I don't know. Or have things gotten smoother over time? I'm not sure. Because it seems like back when Drupal 8 first came out, it was very difficult to figure out how to do anything in Twig.
I think some of it too is just like, Drupal answers now has answers for Drupal 8 stuff too. So you used to not be able to find the answers. I find something else that's really helpful for me is many times when I'm trying to figure out something now, I know I did it on another project, so I can just pull up the other project and see what the structure was. I think for me that there's kind of three important things. One is, like Stephen, like you said, turning on debugging is important. And that what that does, that provides two main things. One is it allows the dump function to work, which I do still occasionally use. And the second thing is it will tell you, if you look in the console or the inspector, it will tell you which template is being used for a particular piece of the page, as well as providing you suggestions for possible templates to override at different levels. The final thing that I would mention is, and this is more of a something that can be a big gotcha, is be careful about digging through arrays into deeper entities in a single template. So, for example, if you have an image field on a content type and you're in the content type template and you want to get the image, some part of the image, well, Drupal actually just stores the FID at the content type level. You can get to the actual file entity in Twig by going, grabbing content dot whatever the image field name is, grabbing the first item in the array and then going into the object of the entity of that file. However, what happens is if you go through that process, you're breaking Drupal's context awareness. So, for example, things like translation stop working. So if you have a paragraph, for example, that has a title field, if you pull that title field directly through that array, that title will always be English or always be Spanish, depending on which one you put. So you need to output the actual rendered array in Twig and then either use a deeper template to do the styling you need, or you need to use a preprocess hook to provide the information that you need at a higher level. If you go just digging, Drupal loses its awareness.
Yeah, so to summarize, if you find yourself digging deep into the render array, stop and rethink what you're doing. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. No doubt about it. What do we mean by file? The next section is types of files. What does that mean?
I think that means the different types of templates. So there's templates for all those different classes of.
We've kind of already discussed
things.
That, right?
Sort of. I mean, this was just calling out specific examples, I think.
All right.
And we can skip it if you want.
No.
Oh.
Can you guys hear the noise in here? Is that coming through the audio?
I see a cat walking out behind you.
Yeah. It's like a zoo here now with Allie home. Okay. So what types of things in Drupal, I use the term things loosely, can you templatize with Twig? Let's go through that list of items.
Everything.
Yeah, pretty much everything. I think the main ones that people start with are entities and fields. So you can provide a template for a content type or taxonomy type vocabulary, or a user. In any field that you create on any of those entities, you can create a template for, just by naming them the file properly. Similar to Drupal 7 and previous, there's an HTML template and a page level template that'll get loaded for pretty much every page. But there's also more specific templates. You can provide a template for web forms or for web form submissions, layouts, blocks, views, menus, like almost anything in Drupal.
I was going to say, it's anytime anything's displayed to the browser, right?
Correct.
Is there anything that you're aware of that you cannot use a template for? And I can't think of any.
I mean, there's always things that I can't think of a specific example, but sometimes you have to provide a template suggestion for something so that you can get something. Yeah. And I do that fairly often, but it's not one of those things that, I can think of something off the top of my head. But the thing is, the vast majority of the things on the page are there's already templates you can override. And then there are some special situations where you have to create your own suggestion. But it's not common. I don't think I have to do that on every single project, but maybe half the projects I'll do that.
And I think
there is a bug with views suggestions. They don't work. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, and it's been like an open issue that keeps getting delayed. I thought it was supposed to come out in 8.8, but it's obviously not there. I was looking at a view template a few days ago, and there's no suggestions still coming out. You can still name it, follow the naming conventions, and they work, but there's no suggestions in the HTML that come out.
And I think that's why it has been fixed, because like the actual process works, and by the time you get to trying to template a view, you've probably already templated some other things at that point.
The interesting thing to me is too that a lot of modules out there, and I had talked about this earlier, but a lot of modules out there also include template files. So, recently been working with Commerce, and the number of templates in the Commerce system are amazing. Allows you to overwrite quite a few different things, and it's always helpful when a module maintainer thinks about how their module is going to be used in the output, and puts those template files in place to be able to kind of pull and overwrite them how you need to. So
I want to jump into something before we move on here. There's a question I forgot to put in the show notes. I wanted to ask you guys. Do you have rules that you set up of what should and should not go in templates? And is it project-based or is it just globally based? Because sometimes you could, let's think of an example. Let's say it's a date format that you could use a template to change how a date is formatted, or you could go back to the entity defined in the database and change how a date is formatted. Where do you decide where you do those things?
So that's a really good question, and you kind of see something similar to that, right, with translation quite a bit, because you have to choose, if you're going to hard code a string in a template file, like you got to make sure that you account for that translatability, right? So, I think ultimately my feeling is that like date formats should definitely be done in Drupal if they can be, because ultimately that's a consistency thing in a lot of places. So you want to make sure that everybody's using the same date format,
and
depending on
the template when you need to.
Yep, exactly. So like, if all the dates on your site are going to be the 3-letter month abbreviation with the date without a leading 0, and then the year, the 4-digit year, you should set that as a date format in Drupal and allow people to set that in their field settings appropriately. And then, as you said, if in some instance, we're only going to do the month, maybe then you overwrite the date format with twig. But I think, there's an aspect there of you're always thinking about the next guy, right? The next person that has to maintain that site or make a change to that site, if they have to change that date format, they're going to kind of have to go through quite a few steps if you don't use a Drupal date formatter and you go into the template. So I think it, as with anything, it depends. I think we've seen instances in translations where strings have been hard coded into a template, like hey, there's Ali now. Coffee refill. So I think you see instances in with translation where people hard code things into templates, like, learn more text or something like that, right? That's pretty generic, and you always want to make sure you're just wrapping that in a T function there to make sure that it's getting brought back into Drupal and translated appropriately. But again, if you can do it through Drupal without having to hard code it into a template, I think you should.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the only really hard and fast no, I guess, in Twig is don't nest entities and dig in. That just causes unforeseen problems. I try to avoid using even like .0 or the first element of an array like as a hard-coded item, because that can sometimes cause problems. But as far as things like dates, I actually found that sometimes Twig handles dates better just directly. In fact, I had an issue with a client a while back where the date format wasn't translating properly because our translation provider just continually would overwrite it incorrectly. And So I was using twig in a view to print the date, but the twig process would incorrectly grab the time zone and just change it at random. Depending on when you viewed the page, it would get the wrong time zone and then apply its own time zone fix based on what it thought it should do. And you would just end up with the wrong date randomly. And it would sometimes be 3 hours ahead, sometimes 8 hours. Like, it was very strange. And when I moved it out of the view and just printed it directly in the template with Twig, it just immediately just worked. So for me, there's no like hard and fast thing except for that. And then the only other thing, which is sort of a tip, sort of a rule, is if you're trying to determine if something exists, many people just use empty or trim it. But I always use the rendered item and then trim it and see if it's empty. Because I find sometimes if you don't render it first, you get like false negatives or false positives. I don't remember which. But you definitely have to render a field and then trim it to see if it's empty or not, truly empty or not. That's one thing that feels a little like it's doing more work than it should just to find out if something is empty.
Yeah. I mean, is that something you really want to do in a Twig template though? Like, I mean, I guess I can see that where you may not know if that field, has a value in it, and you may not want to apply styling if it doesn't. Yeah. But I also wonder, like, you should try to fix that on the Drupal side of things, right? Where it's not gonna display if it's empty. Thinking more, I guess, about views.
Yeah, it's more like if you have a select list, say you have a button that needs to be orange or green, depending on a select list. And if it neither is selected, you need to know if it's empty.
Yeah, and I've used it for conditional. Yeah, I guess it's the same thing. Conditional output.
Yeah, or like if you have
do something completely different. Yeah.
Got it. Also, the moral of this segment is don't do anything with dates. Dates are hard.
Yeah, dates continue. Like after 12, it's been 12 years. After 12 years, dates are
always time zones are always hard, right? Time zones have always been hard.
I mean, in this new world we live in, every day is Wednesday, so they should get a little bit easier.
It's a lot easier now, right?
I'm going to buy the domain "Is Today Wednesday" and have it just say yes 100% of the time. Okay, so this episode is sponsored by Oomph. Do you have a topic that you need to know more about? Do you need some help with planning a project? Are you looking for training in web accessibility, Drupal site building, project management, or analytics? If so, Oomph's training and consulting services can help your team develop and enhance core competencies that serve to optimize your organization's digital strategies. From packaged training programs to highly customized workshops, Oomph can help your team reach a higher level of excellence. Oomph would love to help with your training or consulting needs. Learn more about Oomph's training and consulting services at oomphinc.com/training.
So the next part about templates, right, is that they're pretty customizable. You can affect a bunch of different things just by changing the file name and the structure of a template file, right? So we want to talk about file modifiers, and I think Nick could probably elaborate a little bit on this, but I think the most obvious one is creating different templates for different displays, right? So in Drupal, you have this idea of displays. You can do a teaser display. You can do a page display. You can do a card call out display. You have the ability through file name and structure to basically build out those different displays within and have different templates for each one. How often do you guys use this type of functionality to on your sites?
Almost always. And to be clear, what we mean by this is you could have, for example, a node template. So node.html.twig, and that will apply to every single node entity. You can add a content type modifier to that. So you can say node dash dash, the machine name for the content type .html.twig, and that will only apply to node entities of that content type. And then you can add a final modifier dash dash, whatever the machine name of the display is. So for example, node dash dash homepage dash dash full will only apply to the node entity of type homepage with the full display. So I use these all the time, and they can actually get quite long. In fact, I was looking at one of my projects to see what the longest template I have is, and it looks like it's a field level template.
It always would.
So it's a field paragraph field type with a specific display modifier, and I think it's like 50 characters long. Okay. But you can get very, very, very specific. And I believe we mentioned in Twig debugging, you can look at the inspector and see the suggestions. And that's where I usually start with looking for these. And usually I think the closer to the output, the more specific the template is. And the further up in the list it is, the more generic. So for example, if you're looking at the node template, it'll say, node HTML first, and then node dash dash content type, and then node dash dash display. So if you're looking for something to only override one specific place, you want to grab the most specific template. If you're looking to override the way every node looks, you want the more generic.
There's a page on Drupal.org that describes the naming conventions for all of the file types or template types. We'll put that in the show notes. It's helpful to just kind of go there and give yourself a refresher on how deep you can go. I would have guessed that a field and a view on a particular display would be the longest.
So that is true, but also I've seen some pretty long ones again in commerce where you're affecting certain cart displays, because commerce itself is a pretty long word. So depending on how many times you need to use it in that title,
how long you named your machine names too, right?
That could be it too. Maybe we should have the first Talking Drupal contest, the longest template name that you actually use, not just for this contest.
Nick, no wonder you need folders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I need subfolder. That's something I tested for a client recently too. So if your folders start to get a little unwieldy, you can actually nest them. So the templating system doesn't care, as long as it's in the templates folder, I believe, it doesn't care where the template is. So you can structure it however you want, as long as it makes sense to you. So for example, this particular project has probably 20 field level templates. At some point I might move some of those into their own folders just so that they're a little bit easier to find.
If you get to a tertiary folder structure, I implore you to rethink your templating strategy. You may have gone too far.
And also always keep in mind, it's not always what makes sense to you. It's also important it makes sense to the person who's following you.
Well, yeah, I should have clarified that, but thank you. So what are some common necessities in Twig? So what I mean by that is, there's obviously variables and you can output what's provided to the template, but you do need to sometimes do some logic. So in Twig, the logic always lives within a curly bracket with a % sign. That allows you to do things, for example, like set variables. You can do an if-else or else-if statement. You can do for loops. What are some necessities that you guys use kind of every day with Twig?
Conditionals and loops, I think. I'm trying to think if I use anything else.
Truth be told, I'm looking at the list right now. I think, I've used if, quite a bit, obviously. But yeah, I think that's probably my number one.
Nick, do you have one you're trying to get to here and surprise us or something?
Well, I mean, the one that you labeled next, filters, is probably the biggest.
Yeah, I've used way more filters than I have like actual functions.
Right. So we also have filters in Twig, which allow you to do processing. How would you describe that? Do processing on the element that you're dealing with. So an example would be that you could display a field and use a filter to strip the HTML out of the content. Another filter might be that you take a date and you want to reformat the date. So maybe in the Drupal database, it was day, month, year. When you're displaying the template, you want to put it in a different structure. You can use a date format. Another super handy one is the without. So an example of how you would do that is if in Twig, like on a page node, it basically uses a curly brace content that would basically display all the fields of that node that you have marked as being displayed in, let's say, the display you're looking at. You could, on that one template, say, display all the fields except these 4. So Twig would remove those 4 fields from the display. That's super handy because now you don't have to do additional Twig work to remove them out, like hide them or do something crazy. So
the other way that
go ahead.
The other way that I use without kind of blew my mind when I saw it. But the other way that I use it pretty commonly is if you want to, for example, take the title of the page and put it somewhere and display it slightly differently, you wouldn't want to then render the title a second time. Right. So you could just say, hey, take the title, put it here, take the image, put it over here, and then display the rest of the content however the display says to, just without the title and the image. And so it's super handy.
It's super handy when you're in that situation when you're replacing things at the top of the page.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I mean, I think I've also used trim to take out white space in unintentional white space in some content, or if I know, hey, this content is potential to have white space in it for some reason, trimming that down is super, super useful. I will say that the Twig documentation is pretty stellar, and we will put a link in the show notes to that. You can look at all the filters, all the tags, all the functions, all the tests, and all the operators on one super useful website. So I'm actually looking through the list now to see if there are any other ones that I've used that are particularly nice. I think with commerce, using the currency symbol, currency name is helpful in some cases. And then, as Steve said, date formatting in Twig is, if you need to do it, is super, super useful.
So there's a documentation here, as John mentions, documentation. So you got this Twig stuff that's documented on the Drupal websites, and then there's also stuff that's Twig is off the island. It's a separate product, so you can look at the Twig documentation outside of Drupal as well, which is also helpful.
Yeah. Exactly. And I'm actually looking at the list of filters right now, and there's one I've never used before, but I'm going to find an excuse to, and it's called Humanize. And apparently what it does is it will take a technical name or machine name or something like that and make it human readable. So, for example, it'll take a machine name with underscores or replace the underscores with spaces, or it'll take a camel case variable, hello world, and change it to hello space world. I find it kind of fascinating. And I wonder who necessitated
I wonder what
the creation of that filter. Yeah, I am going to find an excuse to use that.
Because usually an underscore missing is a bad thing.
Yeah. I find that interesting. But so there's a ton of filters that are built in. And then there's some custom modules that provide some additional custom filters for Drupal. I will have the name in the show notes. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's something that gets included in a lot of projects.
So just wondering on that humanize thing, is that an addition to Twig from Symfony? So you would have to have, I mean, Drupal has Symfony running, obviously. So that, for Drupal is kind of a moot point. But if you were just using Twig by itself.
Yeah, no, that's a built-in Twig, Twig function, I believe, Twig filter. And the module I just mentioned is Twig Tweak. It provides a lot of little handy filters and things that people in Drupal need to do with Twig quite often. And I think one of the main things that it provides help with is views integration. So it makes pulling in views or displaying changes to views a lot easier.
Do you guys use Twig tweaks all the time?
Yeah, there were
standard. Is it like part of your standard tool set to install?
No,
there were two modules that kind of did the same sort of thing. Twig tweaks, and then another one whose name I'm forgetting right now, but I think we've actually switched to using Twig tweaks all the time now. And I think I'm with Nick on this one, that we don't necessarily use it on every project, but we do find that it's sometimes necessary to kind of get some additional functionality or some additional help when doing Twig
you're doing
stuff.
What Nick was telling you not to do earlier in the show, which is dig, right? It's providing that interface to prevent the digging.
Yep. Yeah, and gives you some super helpful things. One of the things that comes to mind is like placing a block within a template file. If you have a block that you need to place somewhere, it's always going to be in that same place. You can use Twig tweaks to pull the block based on the block ID and then put it in your template file. So, I think that's super helpful. So the last question I think I have for you guys is from Drupal. We talked about PHP templating, putting PHP directly in template files, moving to Drupal 8 where we rewrote, the template system to use Twig. I don't think anybody's going to disagree, but I'm curious. Do you think, the Drupal 8 rewrite is a better solution? If you don't, why?
No, I think it's definitely better. It's more secure. It's more future proof. It's easier. I mean, other projects use it, so it's easier to get people that don't do Drupal templating to work on Drupal themes. I know a lot of companies, they just have kind of siloed front end guys, and they don't have to change what their engine is between Drupal and whatever other projects they're working on. They all just use Twig.
I mean, I think it also makes more sense, right, to not have PHP code in your templating system, right? Like keeping the logic out of your templates and putting them back into PHP where they belong, right?
Absolutely.
Steven, what do you think?
I think I got a wrap.
Okay. And on that note, if you have any questions or feedback, reach out to us via Twitter @TalkingDrupal or email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can get show updates by signing up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you to our patrons who support Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose that button that says Become a Patron. So as we wrap up today and we survive another week of isolation, Nick, how can people reach you?
You can always find me online at NixVan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere.
How about you, John?
You can find me socially distanced at John Picozzi on all the major social networks and Drupal.org. And then you can find out about Oomph at oomphinc.com.
And I'm Stephen Cross. You can find me on Twitter at Stephen Cross with a PH. Take care, guys.
Have a good one.
Bye.
See you guys next week.
Thanks. Sorry. I was getting some Slack messages here.
No worries.
Me too.
Did you see the patron drop in during the show?
Yeah.
Oh,
His
really?
video came on. I don't know who it
I
was.
did not.
I'll have to go back and look at the recording and chop it out. But he came in for about 5 seconds. I guess realized that his face was showing up and disappeared.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I didn't catch his name. I'll have to go back and watch the video after. So thank you, patron, whoever you were. You could have come in at, I think I had the setting and I fixed it after you dropped in. I should have had a setting on that says don't show your screen if your video's not on. So his video didn't come on, but his headshot did. So I've corrected that now. So in the future that won't happen. So I'll make sure I'll take it out of the final YouTube video, but someone dropped in and then left.
It paste that when you get that screenshot, paste it into Slack. I'm interested. I'm interested because I totally didn't even see it.
I only saw it because
on the show notes.
Nice and wide on my screen for the video recording, and all of a sudden it dropped. It got bigger and went to 4 people.
And you're like, wait,
what's going on here?
What's happening?
All right, guys. Thanks.
Not a problem.
Right,
Talk to you later.
Weekend.
You too.
Bye. You too.